We all live with fire, and as we look at this map here on the screen, who can point out some of the most productive, sustainable grasslands in our nation? Where are they at? Are they in the Northwest? Are they in the Northeast? No, they're right in the middle, aren't they? They're right in the Great Plains, and they reach all the way down to southern Texas and all the way to North Dakota. And that's some of our most rich and productive working rangelands, capable of supporting numerous different livestock species. And the reason for that being is because of three very simple processes that range ecologists like to make more complicated than what they truly are. And those three are fire, grazing, and drought. Those three processes have shaped our most productive grasslands for centuries. And it's part of the reason why our native perennial grasses are not only resilient, but resistant to those three processes. If we think back to all the major wildfires in our nation's history, all the major dry and drought spells, the Dust Bowl, how did our grasses come back after those intense challenges where we just saw nothing but dust blowing for years, right? Okay. It's that resiliency that is built into our native species and definitely our native perennial grass species. So when we talk about fire, whether it's prescribed burning or wildfire, we have to realize that we live in a fire-dominated landscape. And this graph here, the warmer the colors, okay, the oranges, the reds, the more frequent the fire return interval, okay? And this is based upon pre-European settlement. So looking at charcoal estimates and bee pollen estimates, we know that this country, specifically the Panhandle and the Great Plains area, burned on average from 2 to 4 years. So every 2 to 4 years in our nation's history, the Great Plains burned, okay? So what is fire's role as we move forward into a time period dominated by land fragmentation, dominated by wildfire suppression, dominated by continuous working lands that produce fantastic beef and that are capable of producing and sustaining numerous different livestock species? How does fire fit into that picture? How do we start to manage for it and prepare for it? So fuels reduction for wildfire mitigation purposes come to mind right off the bat, okay? Now, do you think there is a time and a place for that wildfire mitigation work? Would today be that day? Probably not. So as land stewards, working and caring for our rangelands, we have to know when to deploy that right tool, when to deploy the right type of grazing during the right type of season, and use whatever tool may be in our toolbox to achieve our specific objectives. Fire, grazing, drought, they're not our enemies. In fact, that's what made the Great Plains, and specifically the Southern Great Plains, so strong. We need to start embracing those tools because that is in our strength. So overall, in terms of general wildfire or general fire habitat, we see enhanced wildlife habitat, forage production, native species, and of course, a suppressed invasive species. So when I say invasive species, what might I be talking about? Cedar, right? Prickly pear, okay? Even those annual invasive species like Japanese brome or even smooth brome as you go up further into the lower panhandle part. Okay, and we also know that fire decreases competition from annual invasive species, and more importantly, it increases nutrient cycling. And this is based off of decades of fire research looking at the big picture of fire signature on our landscape. This is a picture that is near and dear to my heart. This was taken in March of 2017 in Brady, Texas. Now, this was the day of the prescribed burn, and so you can see the black all the way around this building. This building was a stagecoach stop. And as this pasture was lit for a prescribed burn, the landowner suddenly remembered that this stagecoach stop existed, and he wanted to save it. And the burn crew was able to get a line around it, get some hose around it, and save the barn. But what do you think this picture looks like a few months later? Look, get a feel for all that prickly pear. This is August of 2017 in Brady, Texas. Now, they didn't have an abundant rainfall year. It wasn't any record-breaking precipitation amounts, but they had near average rainfall, and they deferred their grazing, okay? So they were able to use the tools that the good Lord gave us, fire, drought, climate, and grazing, to achieve their objectives to control that invasive prickly pear that was encroaching in on their landscape. This is stewardship, using the tools that we have. Andy mentioned that I like to use a lot of technology in my talks and in my presentations and in my research. But guess what? It's technology built on decades-old tools in our toolbox that we have. We're just learning better ways to use it and implement it so that we can be better land stewards and pass that land on to the next generation and hopefully leave it in better shape than when we found it. There are lots of things fire cannot do, and I'm sure many of you in this audience right now can tell me some horror stories, and my heart goes out to each and every one of you. Fire is not an easy subject to talk about. It's not always a fun one. When it's done correctly and properly as it should be, it can be a very strong, powerful rangeland tool. But there are some caveats that go with it, and there are some limitations. So, for example, prescribed burning will not kill resprouting brush. Prescribed burning effects are not long-term. That's getting back to introducing fire as a process, as part of that three-tiered approach to managing our rangelands. And prescribed burning followed by immediate heavy grazing is just a recipe for disaster. So introducing fire into that overall ranch plan where you're already planning for the drought and you're already planning for your next grazing rotation cycle is absolute key and a must. We'll go back to that figure showing the fire return interval of the entire United States. Remember that those orange and red colors are the shorter fire return intervals. So as you look at the state of Texas, keep in mind, every 2 to 4 years, this country has historically burned. And Adam's going to get into a little bit more of what that means for the future. But as you look at this and you learn that this is our evolutionary history, that this is where we came from, where do you want to be looking at this down the road? This is my last and final slide, and I'll leave you with a memory probably no one again wants to remember. But who remembers the Bastrop fires? Okay? That's our generation's Yellowstone fire. That's what shaped the definition of fire in Texas, basically. So think about that fire that happened in 2011. That's in the gray outline area. And look at that little patch of red that you see there. What do you think that little patch of red is? That's another fire that happened 4 years later in 2015 called the Hidden Pines Fire. That means that the old Bastrop fire scar built up enough fuel to burn again 4 years later. And I would like to go back and ask these landowners what they learned from the Bastrop fire that helped them prepare for the 2015 Hidden Pines fire. But thankfully, I don't go that far east. But as you look at that, think that our landscape is so resilient, is so strong, and is so resistant that it's capable of building up enough fuel to be burned again. How do we manage those fuel loads? Okay, thank you.
Let me start with a survey here. Can you please raise your hand if in the last 15 years you have either directly or indirectly been affected by a wildfire? It's burned on your property, you've assisted neighbors, you've assisted landowners, whatever. Okay. So we can safely assume, there was at least 50% of us, that this is a community-wide thing that we need to address. Wildfire is a community-wide issue. And so with that, I want y'all to keep that in mind as I move on through my presentation. This first slide here you're going to see is photos of the wildfire that we had last March 6, 2017. This was taken from a helicopter, and you can see that On that left photo, you've got a city there. And that's why I think this is a community-wide issue that needs to be addressed. It doesn't just affect landowners, it affects those that live in Canadian, because if a big wildfire comes through and we got a lot of tall grass, we may not get it stopped before it gets to the city, and it's going to affect a lot of people. So keep that in mind as I move through this presentation. This is a little bit of a viewer discretion. This next slide is photos from last year's wildfire. And I want y'all to, I'm showing y'all this not to show you how bad fire can be, but just to remind you that, it's very, very hard to see. Ranchers have to see their own livestock laying there dead. And from a monetary perspective, as well as you're tied to those animals. You see them every day, and it's really, really hard. And so I think it's a good reminder for us to look at that and say, hey, this happened to me. What am I going to do now? What practical applications can I make to address this and mitigate this in the future? And so how do we mitigate this? How do we keep our equipment? How do we keep our livestock from being burned down? First thing I'm going to talk about is strategic placement. This top left photo you see here is actually on a ranch that y'all are going to be visiting tomorrow, the Haley Ranch. And they had a wildfire last year. It wasn't the March 6th wildfire, but they had a wildfire last year that probably might have burned their house down if that wheat field wouldn't have been on the southwest side of their house. And I called Lauren Haley and asked her if that was intentional that they had a wheat field there, or that was intentional that they had a house there, and she wasn't exactly sure, but she's sure thankful for it right now. And so with that being said, here in the future, with management decisions that you make, whether it be capital improvements, a barn, a house, and or livestock placement, if you can place it in areas that aren't going to burn, i.e. a wheat field in this example, you're going to be better off. Also, if you end up finding wheat pasture, what a great place to move cattle to in the dormant season when we have wildfires. This bottom right photo is just a few miles east of that ranch. That's on my family's place. And this is kind of what we do and what we can do and options that we've done to help mitigate wildfire in the event of a wildfire. Thankfully, we haven't had, well, actually, we've got a wildfire burning, I think, within 200 yards right now of our place here in Hemphill County. I don't know how big of an issue it is. I don't think it's too big of a deal. It's just stuff smoldering. But this is practical. This is real life stuff. So you can see the two boxes on the north and south side of our headquarters there. We intentionally graze early dormant season. This is specifically just to reduce the fuel loads around our houses. When do fires happen? In the winter. So if we graze them early winter or late fall, reduce that fuel loading and kind of use those as sacrifice areas in the event of a wildfire. If firefighters or you are out there trying to knock down a flame, you're going to be a lot safer and you're going to be a lot more effective. And then the other thing that you can see in that photo is strategically placing chemical brush control. That's a creek right there where we've got a lot of fuel. And predominantly we have southwest winds that are going to push it right towards our headquarters. Well, we, several years ago, implemented some chemical brush control there, one, to reduce the amount of heavy fuels, but also livestock coming in there now can eat a lot of grass, reduce the amount of fuel there in hopes of end up saving our headquarters there. It's not 100% foolproof. The best way to prevent a wildfire is already having something burned. But these are options in the toolbox that you can use. It doesn't have to be prescribed fire. Here, specifically, this top left photo is the same headquarters. It's my family's place. And the black is areas that we burned the past couple of years. There's white lines running through those. Those are fences. The reasoning we did it there in those locations, one is it's on the south side of our place. Most of the time our wildfires come from the south. We've also burned on the north side as well. I didn't show that in this photo, but you can see that we burned it around those fences for multiple applications. If we've got cattle in both those pastures, we have gates at those locations where we burn that. And so with that being said, if you've got to draw cattle in because there's a wildfire coming, you can draw them into those black areas. If they're not going to burn, you've got a gate you can open up. You can move cattle back and forth if you need to. It allows you also to save that fence. At $10,000 a mile replacement, that little bit of fence that has stuff burned around it ain't going to burn anymore. And so now, if a wildfire ends up coming through, that's that much less fence we got to replace. And I guarantee you can talk to any landowners around here, any less fence that they got to build, they'd be willing to do that. On the very left of that photo, you can see the colored area. That was intended to be burned this year. We were hoping to end up doing a prescribed fire just several months ago. Unfortunately, the weather didn't pan out. We didn't have the moisture we needed. We're not going to just go out willy-nilly and start lighting something just because it needs to be lit. There's a lot of strategic stuff that goes into it. I write a 30-page novel practically on each and every burn. Specifics, weather, there's a science to it. It's not 100% by any means, but you can do a lot to mitigate wildfires and mitigate the effect of a prescribed fire turning into a wildfire. All right, so in the bottom right photo there is just an aerial photo of those actual burns from last year. So March 6th was our wildfires. That was actually taken in March. You can see there's a lot of green out there, and I don't know if y'all can see up there. There's a few little black spots. Those are actually cattle out there grazing. So if a wildfire was to go through, they're fine and happy on that green grass right there. We had already received 5 or 6 inches of rain on that, but after post-fire by that date. So this top right photo is what not to do. You can see you've got a little bit of a dozed line next to that fence, but you can see little bridges. See those grass bridges going across? If you end up trying to save a fence or have roads next to a fence, I'd highly recommend having a solid mineral break. The advantage to that is, one, it makes a better road, and two, if a fire happens to be coming by, not like a catastrophic wildfire like last year, just a smaller fire, it's not going to end up crossing that and end up getting onto your place. The advantage to this, too, is reducing fuels next to your fence. Like I said, $10,000 a mile replacement. If you can reduce that by having a nice road around your fence, why not? So you don't want to plow, too deep. I've seen some where you've got dirt stacked up this high because they took so much blade to it. That's not necessary. But this is definitely effective, and it can be useful in the event of a wildfire. If firefighters need to tie into it, they've already got one dozer line through. Now they can bring another dozer and start working off of that, or they can start lighting a backfire off of it. So there's lots and lots of uses for implementing that. I highly recommend it. Works great if you need to check your fence. You can drive right along your road. We did that on all of our exterior boundaries this last year. Thankfully, we hadn't actually needed it for wildfire stuff, but it's there in place if we do need it. Also, if you're replacing stuff, go all steel. Corners, everything. It's not going to burn like wood is. And the issue with using a wood post every once in a while is that's going to burn and smolder for quite some time. And with that being said, it's going to ruin your wire. So you've got to rip out all that wire just because you had one wood post there. So I'd highly, highly recommend going all steel. We also shred. This bottom photo, you can see where we've shredded along the fences. That reduces flame heights and flame lengths, so that in the event of a wildfire, it'll move through, and hopefully it won't end up getting your fence. If it's steel, it's going to be fine. If it's wood, maybe not. And we actually implement that for our prescribed fires. So before we do a prescribed fire, we'll go in and burn that off, and then we've actually even burned under our fences. Just basically, we did a prescribed fire just to burn all the vegetation under our fence. You just run along, light it, it's black. In the event of a wildfire, it's not going to burn. This top photo is just a photo of one of the fires we did out on our place. You can see on the left, that's a lot of people around here call it red grass, little blue stem. And it's not supposed to look like that all the time on the left. It needs to be rejuvenated. And as you can see on the right, with a little bit of fire, it was rejuvenated, as well as an influx of forbs. And with that, you have high protein in those forbs, and those cattle love those forbs when they're this tall. And so we intentionally actually on this one grazed for quite some time after the fire immediately, after we got some green growth going up, and they absolutely loved it. We didn't actually put them on a scale, but I can almost guarantee you they gained a whole lot more than any of the other cattle on the whole ranch. And then on the bottom right photo, you can see another area. This was one of the burns that we did last year. And you can see cattle right on the other side of that black. And they're grazing along. They've got water not too far away. If the fire ends up coming through, it's not very hard. You get your feed truck, throw out some feed out on that black, and they're going to be safe. They may get a little bit of smoke, but they're not going to get burned. And so this is me speaking on behalf of a community-wide perspective. I think we need to embrace that wildfires are going to happen. We can't stop them. It's natural. Whether it be a chain or being drug on a highway or power lines or whatever else, they're going to happen. And so we need to address this as a community. We need to be outspoken. It can't be done from an individualistic perspective. Rancher Roy can't do it on his own. We as landowners, we as a community have to embrace it and do something about it. And so my examples here, Borger and Amarillo. They both, I don't know if y'all seen the news lately, but if you've watched it the past couple of months, you've probably seen where they've done prescribed fire right outside their city. Their local fire departments have embraced that and realized the effects of that and the benefits of that. And so, if you want to talk about that, I'd love to chat with you about that later. Borger specifically has an emergency management coordinator that does prescribed fire. I mean, that's what he does, and they're burning in people's backyards, and those people love it because they saw their neighbor's houses burned down several years ago, and they realized that if they've got black behind them, they're not going to burn. And so maybe that's something we should discuss as a community. So preparation and diversity are key. This little water rig out here, I actually saw a few water rigs out here if y'all want to go look at them. We've got several of them on our ranch. We absolutely love them. We use them for prescribed fire. We can use them for actual wildfires. We can use them for watering trees. You can use them for whatever you want. Hauling water for livestock. This little unit here on the left is actually what we use for our Polaris. Doesn't have as many applications, but it works great for prescribed fire. Little Honda motors work great. If you want to chat about those after, I'd love to discuss that with y'all. Keep in mind wheat pasture, whether it be a farmer or maybe leasing it out and grazing it, or having the option to lease it out and graze it in the event of a wildfire. If you've got cattle that you need to move to, wheat pasture is always a good option, and wheat pasture doesn't burn, not when it's green. Protect your fence and protect your improvements. And so, like I said, wildfires are going to happen. Are you going to be ready? As a community, we have to be proactive. We have to reminisce on the past and look and see how bad it is to remind ourselves, hey, I need to be proactive about this so that in the event of a wildfire, I'm not hurt as bad, so that I can help out my neighbors because I wasn't as affected. And so as a community, let's address this as a whole, and let's see if we can limit their impact. Thank you.
Well, they've sent the lawyer to back cleanup. So we're going to talk a little bit. When Andy asked me to speak about preparing for wildfire, there were a couple of topics that came to mind that I think are pretty important. Here is what I'm going to touch on today, kind of from the legal perspective. The first thing we're going to talk about is the importance of acting reasonably. And that really boils down to the idea of a negligence claim. When we look at lawsuits related to fire, almost always the legal claim is negligence. And so we're going to walk through that a little bit today. Then we're going to talk about evaluating insurance coverages. And I will tell you, I grew up on a ranch. We have had a fire go through, and there was a lot that we didn't know until that fire went through, and we figured out exactly what wasn't insured that maybe should have been or that we thought was. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to talk about some terms to include in your lease agreements that may protect you in the event of a fire. So the first thing is act reasonably. Like I say, by far, if you look at the cases in Texas and around the country, the legal claim that relates to fires is negligence. That's a very common claim that applies to a whole different variety of cases. For example, if I back into someone when I'm leaving the parking lot, that's a negligence lawsuit as well. All right, so negligence fits a lot of different things, but that's the legal claim that will be made. Morgan mentioned the fires in Bastrop. Those fires, currently, there's a negligence lawsuit pending. Landowners and local communities filed suit against a tree management company who had been hired to maintain the easements where the power lines were. The allegation is that they negligently did so because of the overgrowth of trees and the power lines. That's what started the fire. That's an example of a negligence case that's been filed here in Texas. The statute of limitations on those claims, which of course that is how long do you have once the event occurs to file the lawsuit, generally that's going to be a 2-year statute of limitations. There can be exceptions to that, things like tolling, there can be tricky things, but the general rule is a 2-year statute of limitations. So I guess the point I want to make there is if you have suffered injury due to a fire and you think there's a potential claim to be made, you've got 2 years to do it. So don't drag your feet in kind of looking into that and visiting with an attorney if that's something that you're interested in. So when we talk about negligence, essentially what the law says is we all have the duty or the legal responsibility to act as a reasonable person under the circumstances. All right? So just like I say, when I'm driving my car, all right, if I don't look behind me before I back up and I back into someone, most jurors are going to say a reasonable person under the circumstances would not have done that, right? Does that make sense? Same applies when we're talking about wildfire. So you got to think about a jury, right, full of people like us. If they come out and they say, well, we lit a prescribed burn on a day with a, 20-mile-an-hour wind and 40-mile-an-hour gusts, and we hadn't had rain in 6 months, that doesn't sound real reasonable to me under the circumstances, right? And that's the kind of factual analysis that a jury would go through in that type of case. So when we get technical, if we want to be a little bit law schooly here for a minute, the elements of a negligence lawsuit, and the elements are important because that is what the plaintiff, the injured party, would have to prove. The first thing you have to show is that there was a duty. So they have to show that there was a duty owed to the plaintiff. Generally, I tell people, just kind of assume you owe a duty to everybody, all right? The way duty works is if it's foreseeable and the facts aren't too crazy, that's not the legal technical definition. If it's foreseeable and the facts aren't too crazy, then you probably owe a duty. I'll give you an example from law school, right? Let's say that there's a fire and the smoke causes an accident on the highway. Pretty good chance I owe a duty to those folks on the highway if I started the fire. But what if somebody in one of those cars has an accident on the highway and then they go to the hospital where the doctor commits malpractice and accidentally amputates his arm? Am I liable for the amputated arm? Probably not. That's probably stretched it too far, okay? So duty is the first element that has to be proven. The next element is one of the big ones, and that's breach of duty. So what you have to show is looking at that duty to act as a reasonable person. The question is, look at the facts. Did the defendant meet that standard or not? So did they act reasonably? And that's where all those things come in about what was the wind speed like? What direction was the wind blowing? Those kind of details when we're dealing with fire. Same thing if you're dragging a chain on a truck, right? Is that going to be negligent? Maybe it isn't super unreasonable in a year when we've had plenty of rainfall and everything's green. I think this year you're going to have a jury say unreasonable to be doing that. The next element is important, and that is causation. So the plaintiff, the injured party, has to prove that the defendant caused the damage, right? So that's our fourth item is damage. And I'll tell you, in a lot of fire cases, it's really hard to prove causation because you just don't know who did it, right? Somebody driving down the road throws out a cigarette, starts a fire. When the fire is put out a week later, you're never going to be able to figure out who started the fire with that cigarette, right? And you can't prove causation there to go after somebody. So that's an element to keep in mind as well. So like I say, when you're dealing with negligence claims, those are very fact-specific. It's something if you are injured, you need to make sure that you visit with an attorney within that 2-year statute of limitations. And if you're a person who's utilizing fire, if you're using fire from a prescribed burn perspective, or if you're welding, and something were to catch fire, you need to make sure you're acting reasonably. Make sure you're following the rules as far as when burning is appropriate. Make sure that you've got water on hand. Think about cutting those fire lines, those type of details from the defendant's perspective. The next slide we'll talk about is evaluating insurance coverage. And like I say, until you kind of dig into this, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about how insurance works and exactly what is covered. The first thing I'll say is you need to read your insurance policy. Yes, really. You need to read your insurance policy. And all of it, okay? I repeat this 3 times because y'all remind me of my father, some of you, and you're sitting out there thinking, I'm not going to read that insurance policy, right? My dad doesn't even make it through the whole newspaper, much less the whole insurance policy. But really reading that policy, the policy itself, any endorsements, any exclusions, that's so important when we're talking about understanding what that coverage looks like. And listen, every policy is different, so I'm going to talk about some generalities today, but it's really important to make sure you evaluate that policy with your agent to make sure you understand exactly how that works. Okay, so that's what I just said. Language, the coverage depends on the language in your policy. One thing I think is key is to keep in mind there is a difference between liability insurance and property insurance. So I might have a $2 million liability policy, right? That's fairly common when we're talking about ag operations. So I have a $2 million liability policy, but that may not and probably won't cover my property if the property damaged is mine, unless that is specifically scheduled as property on a policy. All right, and we'll talk about some examples in just a minute. What that liability policy covers is if somebody comes on my property and gets injured, it protects me from that injured person's lawsuit. Does that make sense? Different than protecting me for my own damaged property, right? So when we look at that, all landowners need liability insurance. I preach this quite a bit, and I really am a believer. If you have property, you need liability insurance for a couple of reasons, right? Probably the most important of those is what they teach us in law school. They like to take all the plaintiff's lawyers aside in one room on the first day, and they teach them a little mantra. When someone gets injured, who do you sue? Everybody, okay? And when you sue everybody, who do you make sure you sue? Anybody with a lot of money. And who always has a lot of money? Landowners, okay? So my point is, if a lawsuit happens, if someone gets injured on your property, if a fire starts, if a lawsuit happens, the odds of you as a landowner being named as a defendant, even if you're going to win, even if you're going to get yourself dismissed out, the odds of you being sued are quite high. And what you want to have that liability insurance for, not only to protect you in the event of a judgment, but is also to provide a defense. Right? If I get the papers in the mail that I'm getting sued, I'm going to turn that right over to my liability insurance company, and they've got lawyers that handle all of that. So having liability insurance, very important. From a burn perspective, if you're going to be involved in prescribed burning, which we've talked about quite a bit today, there are certain levels of liability coverage that offer you limited liability by statute. You don't have to have liability insurance if you're going to conduct a prescribed burn, but you dadgum sure ought to, right? Because the way the statute works is there is a state statute here in Texas, and if you meet the requirements of that statute, you are offered limited liability. It's a good defense tool for your attorney if that fire gets away. And the requirements from that statute, you have to be burning on ag or conservation land, and then you either have to have a burn conducted by a certified and insured prescribed burn manager or by the members of a prescribed burn organization. In order to be a member of a qualified PBO or in order to be that burn manager, you've got to carry liability insurance of at least $1 million per occurrence or a $2 million minimum policy aggregate, which means during the policy period, the minimum is at $2 million or higher. All right, so if you're burning, highly recommend carrying that level of insurance. And like I say, if you are a prescribed burn manager or a PBO, you have to have that to get that protection. Okay, for landowners, how much insurance coverage do I need? Well, it depends on what you're doing. Okay, I always tell people, if you have a pumpkin patch or a pick your own strawberries type operation, I'm upping that coverage, okay? Because we have, the public is there, we have a much higher odds of someone getting injured. If you're like my family and we just have a place, we run some cattle, nobody's ever really, comes out, probably don't need quite as much insurance coverage. You need to visit with your agent because that's gonna depend on what you've got going there, all right? Let's talk about property damage. If your property is damaged by a wildfire, like I say, that liability policy does not cover you for property damage unless you have scheduled that property. Okay, so the best example I have, we had a fire burn through and it burned up a trailer on our place. We didn't have that trailer listed as covered property. It wasn't protected. Even though we had $1 million liability policy, it didn't cover the trailer. We should have scheduled that separately on the policy. Same for tractors. I mean, you think about what you pay for tractors or balers or cotton strippers, that kind of stuff. Make sure you've got insurance on those if you want to have protection in the event of a fire. Now, if you've got a note on them, most companies are going to require you to have insurance. If you're like us and you've got a bunch of old junkers, you may not have insurance on them. Some policies limit the amount of firearms you can claim under that insurance policy at $5,000. I'm going to guess some of us in this room have more than $5,000 worth of guns in our house, okay? They sometimes limit jewelry, furs, artwork. Cash is one I wasn't aware of. But sometimes they'll limit the amount you can recover on cash that's at your house. So if you hide money under the mattress, you might ought to think about that on your insurance policy. So again, read that fine print. The other thing I'll note here, and this really isn't a legal thing, but I think it's important, is you should have an inventory of your house in some way. I don't know if y'all have ever known someone who has lost a house due to a fire or has been robbed, But trying to make a list of what is no longer there for insurance is a nightmare, right? I had friends that had their house burglarized several years ago, and I mean, for 6 months, they would come up with something else that they had forgotten to put on the insurance paperwork when you're dealing with that. So there's several ways to do that. My grandma, I think, pioneered this back in the 80s. You remember those camcorders you had to like set on your shoulder and like lug around with the tapes in them? When my grandma died, in her safety deposit box, we found a tape, and she had walked through her house and like opened the drawers and videoed her house. And we thought, what an odd thing to have in your safety deposit box. No, it was genius. If she would have had a fire, she pops that in the VCR, and it's real easy to write out what she had in that house. You can do the same thing today with your iPhone, right? Pretty simple to do and easy to think about. The last thing that I'll touch on relates to lease agreements. If y'all have grazing leases, the first thing I'm going to say, I think this is probably what I preach most often in my job, is you need to get those leases in writing. And yes, I mean all of them, really, okay? I say this because, again, my father, we run cattle over in eastern New Mexico. My dad has had free legal advice for 9 years. I'm still working on getting those leases in writing, okay? Finally, he came to me last year. We leased our neighbor's place across the road, and he says, I'm going to let you do a written lease. The angels sing, okay? But he follows up with, I don't want all your legal crap in there. You get 1 page, okay? So my point with that is, if you look at some of the materials I have on a leasing checklist, I'm going to give you 8 pages worth of things to think about. You can get a pretty good lease in 1 page, turns out, thanks to my dad. And you're sure better off with that than with nothing. All right, so leases in writing is the first step. When we're thinking about fire issues, some terms you want to think about including: who repairs fences in the event of a fire? In any lease, who repairs fences should be a major issue. Address both repair and replacement. And you can set that up any way you want. You can put it all on the landlord or all on the tenant. What we do in our leases is we split it. The landlord, the landowner pays for the materials, the tenant pays for the labor. You can split that up any way you want it, but address that because that can be a major issue. If there is a fire, if there's a wildfire that comes through, you're probably going to have to modify that stocking rate depending on how much of the place burned. Who's going to make that decision? How is it going to be made? Those sort of issues are important. And then this seems simple, but it's something that is important. Make sure you've got emergency contact for each other in a lease agreement. This is particularly important if you're dealing with an absentee landowner or if you are an absentee landowner. Make sure you've got an emergency contact number for the other party in case something goes on. All right, so the last thing I'll mention on leases, I've got a handbook if y'all are interested in that. It's called the Texas Agriculture, the thing's called the Texas Agricultural Leasing Handbook. It's got information in there on drafting grazing and hunting leases. It's available for free. You can probably just Google that title. You can contact me. I'll give you my info here. I'm happy to get anybody a copy or a PDF if anyone needs that as well. So with that, I think we're ready for questions if my fellow folks want to come up. At programs, I always refer to this portion as Stump the Chump, so I guess we're ready.
I want to preface their questions just a minute. We've been so affected by wildfires in our community. This is why our Ag Committee wanted to address this subject. Do you think what they had to say was relevant and important to hear? Let's tell them again. Okay, now, I don't want this conversation to be controversial, but we've had a lot of controversy in our community about wildfire. So ask them questions that are not controversial questions, but that get to the point of what we need to learn so that we can all be banded together and still good neighbors and friends. So who wants to ask the first question? You want to answer over here with it? Yeah.
So the gentleman's question was, how often can you burn and still keep productive, viable rangelands full of integrity? And the answer is really up to you. So the classic, it depends. What your goals and objectives are, and what type of operation are you running? Are you cow-calf? Are you stalkers? How long do you want to graze? What type of grazing period are you looking at? Are you a multi-species type of operation? We get down by San Angelo in the hill country area, and believe it or not, access deer are factored into the stalking rate. And so it really depends. It also depends on what type of wildlife habitat you're wanting to create and leave behind. But that figure that I showed you about the fire return interval, historically speaking, is a pretty safe one to go on. So you could probably burn as often as 2 years, or you could probably even push it out to even 6 or 8. But it just depends. And like Mr. Isaac's picture showed, our grasses up here, we get little blue stem and it gets 3-4 years of growth on it, and that thing's just not palatable anymore. It gets real wolfy and it's not desirable. Crude protein plummets, and you just can't get cows on it unless there's nothing else to eat. And so taking an inventory of what grasses you have out there and how resilient they are. Certain grass species are highly resistant to direct fire effects, and some grasses come back earlier than others. And just like Mr. Isaac said too, you get a flush of forbs as well. So it really just depends how many pastures you have to work with. Are you wanting to flash graze? But it can be fit into that rotation cycle of grazing, burning, rest type of scenario. And that rotation is really what can make the difference on your bottom line sometimes. So no right or wrong answer. Absolutely. I'll just clarify the gentleman's contact. Dr. Tim Steffens is in the room, and he kind of wrote the book on how often you can burn and how often you can graze, and he's a phenomenal resource to have up here in this panhandle country. Your county extension agents, they can help you out with that. They probably know the stalking rate around here better than anyone else. Andy, any other resources you have at your disposal? This is the best of the best in the room, and they've seen the grazing, they've seen the burning, and they've seen the drought. So putting together a plan is in your best interest by far.
Yes, ma'am. So there is a Texas Panhandle Prescribed Burn Association that covers the Texas Panhandle. It's primarily several individuals that run large operations, and they have equipment and stuff that can be leased out, but most times when they're using it, or when there is good fire weather, they're using it. And if I lived here full time, I would already have jumped on board of starting one. I really do think Hemphill County, Roberts County, this area could use one just for these few counties. Like I said, if I lived here, I'd be on board for it, but unfortunately, I don't live here full time.
Just real briefly, Morgan and I have done a fact sheet that talks about liability with prescribed burning. It walks you through that statute that we mentioned. It talks about the requirements of being a certified and insured prescribed burn manager, and it talks about the requirements of a PBO. There's our contact information there, phone number, email. If you contact either of us, we're happy to get you a copy of that.
Okay, just to clarify, what provisions are made for the protection of wildlife? Okay, I definitely see your point of view, and I'm not trying to be controversial or confrontational at any means, but what type of provisions existed back in 1800 for those wildlife? Okay, so an intentional prescribed burn. Yes, there are several different mitigation things you can do to mitigate those effects on wildfire. You can do different ignition patterns to create more of a mosaic type burn where you're not burning absolutely everything, not 100% black. You can have a mix of burned and non-burned, so you create edge effect, which is beneficial for multiple species of quail, deer, antelope, pronghorn, you name it. That edge effect is also what they love. And then also, you can, patch burn grazing is not only beneficial to cattle, but it's also beneficial to wildlife. So nobody says you have to burn a certain amount of acreage every year for a wildlife or a livestock operation. It just depends on what you want to do and what you're able to achieve with that year's conditions. How many of y'all have experienced a similar or same spring or summer for the last 5 years, 10 years? Nothing is predictable in this country. I mean, you never know when you're going to get the rain, and you never know when you're going to get the right wind. And so knocking those burns out, if those are a part of your objectives, and just doing a little bit at a time, and having a diversity of not only season of burn, seasonality of burn, so summer, fall, winter, spring, but also the fire return interval. So you might want to have a patch that was burned last year, and then another patch that was burned 5 years ago, and create choices for the wildlife and create choices for your livestock as well. Almost all of our native wildlife species are very good at mitigating fire on their own. I kind of have a philosophy that the more we interfere and the more we put our touch on it, the more we just mess it up. And so if I can employ a natural evolutionary process, that in itself is getting the most bang for the buck and doing the most good instead of artificially creating something. I hope that answered your question. Yeah. Adam and I will tag team this one. So the lady's question in the back is what is the general cost of implementing a prescribed burn via commercial and insured prescribed burn manager? So first and foremost, make sure whoever you are using to commercial or contract that burn is licensed and insured from the Texas Department of Agriculture. TDA regulates it very similar to a pesticide license. So these guys are required to go to a burn school, to show training, to show experience, and then it's based on individual approval by the Texas Department Prescribed Burn Board. Y'all have several choices, maybe not several, but a few choices of prescribed burn managers, commercial prescribed burn managers up here in the Panhandle. And Adam, do you know how they charge? In my neck of the woods, a lot of folks charge by the perimeter mile around the burn unit. They'll have a basic minimum fee, and some other folks will charge by the acre or even by the day. So it just depends on who you get to use and how they run their burn crew and burn operation. Most burn crews, though, commercially speaking, are turnkey operations. So they bring the labor, they bring the equipment, they write the burn plan, they communicate with the neighbors, they communicate with the volunteer fire department, county officials, and if they don't, they are not acting reasonably and aren't doing the due diligence and conducting the appropriate standards of care. So if you do hire someone, make sure they know what they're doing.